George is an American, 31 years old, of Chinese descent, a Yale graduate, and a rising star in the North American medical community. Qiao Zhi is a nearly 60-year-old farm woman who has lost her husband. The years have worn her down, leaving her as barren and lifeless as the dry, cracked land behind her. Qiao Zhi is George's mother. George was born during the strictest period of China's family planning policy. He has an older brother and sister, and rural folks were not very knowledgeable about contraception. That's how he came to be. He was originally supposed to be named Zhang Panpan because the Asian Games were approaching, and the mascot was a chubby panda named Panpan. When she was pregnant with George, Qiao Zhi carved a crooked panda out of wood and painted it with ink. She had a plan. The corn would be ready for harvest in a few days, and the money from selling it would be just enough to pay the fine for having an extra child. George was born in the autumn. He was fair-skinned and chubby, holding tightly to Qiao Zhi's thumb with his little hand, staring at his mother with eyes as black as onyx. Qiao Zhi placed the wooden panda next to him and smiled. Before she had finished her confinement period, the family planning officers came. Qiao Zhi was tied up like a criminal and taken to the township health center. Cold forceps and knives stirred inside her. She didn't cry. Her youngest child was so adorable. It was fine to be sterilized. She didn't want any more children anyway. The autumn rain was chilling, and her lower abdomen felt heavy as she hurried home. Panpan must be starving. She wiped the rain from her face and anxiously pushed open the wooden door. There was no crying. She rushed into the house like a madwoman. The calm was empty, and even the oilcloth had disappeared. She howled like a beast and turned around to see Zhang Jianping stepping over the threshold, holding that red oilcloth. "Where is he? Where is the baby?" she demanded. This cowardly middle-aged man avoided her gaze and mumbled, "I asked you, where is he?" Qiao Zhi's sharp voice was filled with desperation, tears streaming down her face, highlighting the yellow-brown spots on her cheeks. He's gone." Zhang Jianping looked down, unable to meet her eyes. "Gone." Qiao Zhi's voice rose, her eyes bloodshot with anxiety. "Gone where?" Zhang Jianping was very thin. His old tunic hung on him like a robe. He nervously rubbed his pants, the large patches on his knees nearly reaching his thighs. The family was too poor. The second child's pneumonia couldn't be delayed any longer, and if they had to pay the fine now, the consequences would be dire. The damp night mixed with fog. In the dim light, Zhang Jianping's gaunt face looked even more prominent. His eyes were red, and his hand holding the oilcloth trembled slightly. The air was stifling. Realizing something was wrong, Qiao Zhi's voice trembled. "Where is he, huh?" After a long silence, Zhang Jianping raised his head, looking at Qiao Zhi. He shakily lifted his right hand and suddenly slapped himself. Qiao Zhi clearly saw a tear fly from his eye, merging into the pitted ground. "I abandoned him." A flash of lightning tore through the sky, illuminating Qiao Zhi's pale face. Her hair clung to her face in disarray, like a grim scar. George woke up from his dream once again. The same dream that had haunted him for 20 years. In the dream, a cold hand, like a slimy snake, slipped down his waistband, moving slowly, inch by inch, across his skin. The man's voice was raspy, like an old arrow that hadn't been played in years, its strings loose and out of tune. "Don't be afraid." But how could he not be afraid? He was only 8 years old. He didn't understand why his adoptive father was putting his hand there. He only felt fear, a chill seeping into his bones, making him shiver. George closed his eyes and shook his head, trying to forget the unpleasant dream. But he knew this dream had been with him for 20 years, and it might follow him for another 20, and another 20 after that, until his grave. The overcast sky in New York was gray and dreary. His head throbbed with pain. He opened the drawer, took out a bottle of pills, shook out 3, then thought better of it and shook out 3 more. He popped the pills into his mouth before remembering to get some water. Among the pile of dirty dishes, he found a relatively clean cup and filled it with cold water from the tap, gulping it down. He looked around his apartment. Thick dust covered the furniture. Clothes and miscellaneous items were piled haphazardly on the sofa. The ivory-colored floor tiles were barely recognizable, and a few darts were stuck crookedly into the expensive handcrafted coffee table. With a blank expression, he walked into the bathroom. A few seconds later, the sound of running water could be heard, and steam began to fog up the glass. George had no friends. Asians with black hair and yellow skin were already unwelcome, and someone as taciturn and cold as he was even more so. In school, his classmates called him aloof and unsociable. Later, when he started working at the hospital, his colleagues whispered, "The mute who performs surgery like an artist." He had once adopted a stray dog and named it Panda. But Panda died. He had taken it to the vet, who said it had been abandoned because it was sick. George wondered if he had also been abandoned because he was sick. Since he could remember, his adoptive father would beat him whenever he got drunk. George would cry in fear, calling out, "Dad," but his adoptive father would grab him by the collar and breathe alcohol fumes into his face. "I am not your dad. Your real dad didn't want you and threw you away like trash." He often ended up bruised and swollen, but when his adoptive father sobered up, he would buy George snacks and toys, trying to comfort him. "I may not be your real dad, but I care for you more than he ever did, right?" This cycle repeated itself endlessly, erratic and unchanging. George didn't know who his real father was. Eventually, he found himself eagerly waiting for his adoptive father to get drunk and beat him. Sometimes, he would even provoke him on purpose, so that amidst the beating and cursing, he could hear something about his biological father. He was only 6 years old then. Over time, he learned that his adoptive parents had found him under a bridge while visiting their hometown. When they picked him up, he was barely alive, drenched from the rain, clutching a wooden panda, more exhaling than inhaling. That was all he knew. He was much more sensitive than his peers. While other 6- or 7-year-olds were running around and playing, seeking affection from their parents, he preferred to run to the small train station in the county and watch the trains. He always felt that one day a train would take him to find his real parents. He would save his meager pocket money, penny by penny. He knew he didn't belong here and that one day he would leave, away from his alcoholic adoptive father and gambling adoptive mother, to a vast new world with his biological parents. Had the story continued like this, he would still be considered lucky for not freezing to death in his infancy. Despite the hardships, his adoptive parents had given him life. On his 8th birthday, he got beaten again for no apparent reason. His adoptive father hung him up, reeking of alcohol. "You little bastard, you eat my food, drink my drink." By then, George was already quite mature for his age. He looked at his adoptive father with a gaze that even held a bit of pity. Living a brutal life at the bottom of society, his adoptive father could only vent his frustrations by beating a child. George couldn't understand why someone like his adoptive father even bothered living such a life, a constant cycle of self-torture. His gaze only further enraged his adoptive father, who lashed him with a belt repeatedly. The pain made George break out in a cold sweat, but he didn't cry out. It wasn't because it didn't hurt, it was because he had no energy left. His adoptive mother's sharp voice rang out from the bedroom. "You damned fool, stop beating that little bastard. I've just serviced another client, and you're getting on my nerves." That night, the pain kept him from sleeping. He couldn't even lie down, only able to rest on his stomach. The moonlight softly shone through the window. He looked at the crooked band carved on the wooden panda and wondered if his biological parents would beat him. No, they wouldn't, because they didn't want him at all. Suddenly, he felt that finding his biological parents was meaningless, as he no longer craved to be coddled or asked for a piece of candy. He hated them. The door creaked open. Judging by the footsteps, it was his adoptive father. George quickly closed his eyes and pretended to be asleep. Sober, his adoptive father walked over, sat on the bed, and pulled back the blanket to look at his back. Soon, the cool scent of medicinal herbs filled the air. George lay there stiffly, not daring to move. After a long while, the ointment was applied, and his shirt was pulled back down. He exhaled a small breath. Maybe his adoptive father wasn't such a bad person after all. Maybe alcohol was like a magical potion that could turn someone into a completely different person. Years later, George would often think how pathetic that child was, willing to cling to any warmth offered to him. Just like a person walking alone in the dark, rushing towards any distant light, whether it was the warm glow of a kitchen fire or the eerie light of a grave. Just as he thought his adoptive father was about to leave, the man's hand suddenly slipped into his pants. At that time, George didn't understand what it meant. He only felt an immense humiliation. Just a moment ago, he had genuinely believed his adoptive father was a good person. He was scared, he struggled, but his adoptive father pinned him down on the bed, and that cold hand became a lifelong nightmare. When George arrived at the hospital, the state prison had just sent over a prisoner who had completed his sentence. He was supposed to be released, but he suddenly suffered a heart attack, so he was rushed to the nearest hospital. The patient's condition was very tricky, and several colleagues looked troubled. When they saw George coming in, they quickly pushed him into the operating room. The surgery was a great success. As George came out, Emily exclaimed dramatically, "George, if you smiled more, I'd definitely pursue you." George was taken aback and gave a slight smile before heading to the restroom. Emily muttered to herself that this Asian man had everything going for him: deep-set features, a tall and sturdy build. Even by her European standards, George was definitely a handsome man with a good educational background and top-notch medical skills. However, he was quite an oddball. Before the surgery, there was no time, but after seeing the patient's information, George's expression suddenly darkened. The long-avoided pain surged back unexpectedly, and his face turned ashen, his pupils narrowing like needles. Pedophile. Memories flooded back, leaving him no escape. Countless nights, he was unable to sleep, haunted by the terrifying, twisted face of his adoptive father every time he closed his eyes. He dared not get close to people, believing that everyone harbored ill intentions. He avoided public places, as the various scents and odors of those around him suffocated him. His style of dressing was peculiar, with his shirt always tightly tucked into his belt, even though he was 31, a 6th-degree black belt in Sanda, and spent his free time immersed in fitness equipment. Yet his heart had never found peace. At this moment, George quietly looked at the sleeping man, unkempt and in his 50s, about the same age as his adoptive father. 5 years ago, the man had been imprisoned for molesting young girls, but after only 5 years, he was being released. Soon, another child might fall victim to his abuse. Why hadn't he died? Yes, why hadn't he died? The man had a history of drug allergies and severe heart failure. Maybe all George needed was a single aspirin. The prison hospital records were poorly kept. He could easily alter the man's allergy history and escape without suspicion. However, the first medical book he ever read had the Hippocratic Oath on its front page. "I will use my power to help the sick to the best of my ability and judgment. I will abstain from harming or wronging any man by it. If I keep this oath faithfully, may I enjoy my life and practice my art, respected by all men and in all times. But if I swerve from it or violate it, may the reverse be my lot." He clenched the aspirin tightly in his hand. He had taken an oath. He couldn't harm anyone. He was a doctor, and if he violated medical ethics, even the gods wouldn't spare him. But, did the gods know his suffering? That cold hand seemed to brush his face, his back, his waist, and kept moving down. His hair stood on end, and a cold sweat slicked his neck and hairline. He raised the aspirin. George knew a bit of German and Spanish, hadn't forgotten his Chinese, and even spoke some dialects. When he left the house, he ran into Mrs. Wilson walking her dog. The stout woman greeted him, and he nodded slightly, as usual. Mrs. Wilson would never know that George carried all his belongings in his coat. He had no concept of money and rarely spent any. He had a lot of cash, which he had exchanged for euros in the morning and finally converted into renminbi. He was going back to China, escaping back to his homeland. He had never taken a vacation, so the hospital approved his leave very quickly. He had everything meticulously planned. even prepaying his utilities. Every detail was covered, nothing left to chance. When his mentor, Paul, had seen his Lundborg suture technique, he had been full of praise. "I've seen many geniuses, but you're the first with such a brilliant mind and meticulous execution." Despite his thorough preparations, returning to China was still quite a journey. George had an extraordinary memory since childhood. The small town had undergone drastic changes, but he still found his adoptive parents' house by relying on his memory and the largely unchanged layout of the main street. That morning, the alley was still waking up. The damp stone road had a thin layer of moss. Steamers for making buns were piled high at the alley entrance. The old house had peeling wooden doors with faded couplets of Qin Xiong and Jingde pasted on them, the paper now a pinkish hue, tattered by wind and rain, with the horizontal scroll faintly legible, "Harmony at home brings prosperity." George quietly looked at the door, as if seeing the fearful boy he once was through that thin barrier. The door creaked open, and George instantly recognized his adoptive father. He had aged significantly, now bald, wearing discolored old pajamas, his belly protruding, and his face full of lethargy. The old man carried a spittoon, and upon seeing a tall young man at the door, he paused but didn't acknowledge him. With sleepy eyes, he headed to the public restroom at the alley's entrance to empty the spittoon, muttering curses under his breath. Crazy. George thought, he doesn't recognize me at all. He had intended to ask if he knew where his biological father was, but decided against it. His adoptive father's hometown was a village just below the town. George went there and found the village chief. "Could you check if any family lost a child 31 years ago?" The chief was taken aback and smiled bitterly. "Also, check if any family abandoned a child." This was a nationally renowned impoverished area, and the village chief still used a loudspeaker from the 1980s. "Listen up, villagers. If any family lost a child 31 years ago, come to the village committee." Before finishing his sentence, the chief suddenly froze, his expression turning serious. 31 years ago? George nodded. The chief stomped his foot hard, his eyes reddening. "Come with me." George followed the village chief along a winding path for quite some time before finally seeing a wisp of smoke rising from a mountain hollow. There stood two dilapidated mud houses, crooked and weather-beaten, seemingly on the verge of collapse. A ragged cloth hung as a curtain over the door, and in the yard, a donkey, blindfolded, turned a millstone, grinding white soy milk that filled the stone trough. A woman sat with her back to them, hunched over, her hair already graying, staring blankly at the rotating millstone. A yellow dog lay at her feet, licking her hand, but she showed no reaction. The village chief called out, "Qiao Zhi, your child has come back." His voice trembled, a mix of joy and tears. The woman remained motionless, her back still turned. "Qiao Zhi." The village chief called out again, louder this time. She heard him now. She slowly turned her head, glanced at the village chief, then turned back again. Suddenly, she whipped her head around, her gaze fixed on George standing next to the village chief. Her eyes widened, and she jumped up from her stool, rushing over like the wind. She threw herself in front of George, grabbing his sleeve tightly. George tried to pull away, but she held on tighter, staring at him unmoving, as if petrified. She stared at George for a long moment. Her eyes reddened, and then she suddenly locked his arm in a tight embrace, tears streaming down. Her eyes, afflicted with pterygium, were bloodshot, making her tears seem less clear, only adding to the cloudiness of her gaze. Her face, marked by the passage of time, let the tears flow into its wrinkles. She even had age spots densely covering the corners of her eyes. She didn't wail but sobbed rapidly, clutching him tightly. She was only 58. George looked at this aged woman coldly, neither sad nor happy. As a child, his biggest dream was to see his biological mother, to be held by her, to be spoiled by her. After going abroad, he had thought he hated her for abandoning him, for making him endure unspeakable shame and humiliation, for not strangling him at birth if she didn't want him. But now, he only felt sorrow. Back then, she had the heart to abandon him, a premature baby, and now she was playing the role of a loving mother, thinking he was just an audience member? No. She forgot he had always been the tragic character in this play. Qiao Zhi kept crying, her tears soaking George's expensive suit. George frowned and calmly pulled away from her. Qiao Zhi lunged back, clutching him tightly. "You're my son, you're Pan. George sneered. "How can you be sure?" Qiao Zhi wiped her tears haphazardly and pointed to his chin with a trembling finger. "That scar on your chin, it's from oil splashing. I was holding you while cooking, and the oil splattered, burning your chin. This shape doesn't change. Besides, no mother wouldn't recognize her child." Her voice grew smaller, like a child admitting a mistake. George found it increasingly ridiculous. "Whether I'm your son or not, you are quite the mother, letting oil burn a premature baby." "How do you know he was premature?" Qiao Zhi's eyes lit up with excitement and urgency as she clung to his arm. "How do you know he was premature?" "He was premature, and then he was lost." "Lost?" George looked at the dirt-covered mountains and sneered inwardly. "Lost? More like abandoned." George was led to the Kong, a traditional heated bed, while Qiao Zhi crouched on the ground, adding firewood to the stove pit. In the glow of the firelight, George could clearly see a large scar on Qiao Zhi's hand. He recognized it. It was from oil splashes. His scar was only pea-sized, but hers formed a grotesque and ugly patch. The Kong quickly warmed up, filling the air with the fragrance of meat. The firewood gently licked the bottom of the pot, casting a reddish glow that reflected Qiao Zhi's unusually joyful, yet cautiously hopeful face. On this late autumn evening, despite the cold wind constantly sneaking in through the tattered door curtain, George inexplicably felt comforted. The village chief sat on the edge of the Kong, watching this silent mother and son pair. After a long while, he sighed, took out a cigarette, and lit it. Qiao Zhi made a light stew of pork ribs, added water to the pot, and began simmering the ribs. The Kong was warm, filled with the aroma of meat, and Qiao Zhi's face lit up with joy as she carefully cooked. She made a simple stew of pork ribs and served it with pickled cucumbers. She filled a bowl with rice for George and ladled him a generous bowl of soy milk. The aroma of the soy milk was particularly strong. As George looked at the thick bowl of soy milk, he somehow found the taste exceptionally familiar, like a scent from deep in his memories, gently lingering in his nostrils. Dong! George startled as a large chunk of rock sugar was suddenly dropped into his bowl, quickly dissolving in his soy milk and splashing onto his face. He looked up, meeting Qiao Zhi's pleased smile. Qiao Zhi chuckled foolishly, licked her chapped lips, and awkwardly rubbed her hands. Suddenly, George felt angry. Her cautious demeanor made it seem like he was at fault, like he was oppressing the dignity of a simple and honest rural woman, like he was overlooking a mother's dignity. Before the age of 8, scenes like this were a dream come true for him. He had waited for her for 8 years, waiting for her to come back and tell him, "Mom's come to find you." He had thought that if she came to find him, he would pretend to be angry, throw a tantrum, cry a bit, and ultimately go back happily with her. But what he waited for was just that cold hand. At the age of 11, George stole some money from his drunken foster father's pocket, enough to buy 2 train tickets. He had no valid identification. At the ticket counter, he gave all his money to a stranger, asking him to take him on the train. Anywhere was fine. At 11, he didn't bring anything with him, thinking it was a complete farewell to the past. The man finally took his money and disappeared without a trace. George sat at the train station gate until late at night, looking up at the stars in the sky, raising his head high, forcing back his tears. He didn't want to go back. When he was truly starving, the station police officer gave him a bowl of instant noodles. "Little buddy, where's your home?" He shook his head. "What are your parents' names?" He shook his head again. The officer sighed. "What's your name then?" He hesitated for a moment. "My name is Pan. What's your last name?" He shook his head firmly. In fact, he was already in the 4th grade of elementary school, with his foster father surnamed Yang and called Yang. The officer thought the child might have some intellectual disability and temporarily sent him to an orphanage. Later, a message looking for relatives for Pan was broadcast on TV and newspapers, but there was no response. George spent a year in the orphanage like this. A year later, the orphanage was ready to permanently adopt George, but they had been wrong from the beginning. This child was not mentally handicapped. He was exceptionally intelligent and performed very well academically. He just didn't like to talk and didn't like to take baths. Mr. and Mrs. Dawson from the United States spotted Pan among the group of children at first sight. He was thin, malnourished, with a big head, wearing black-framed glasses, looking awkward and cute, just like Harry Potter from Hogwarts. A strange person with green eyes and blonde hair was not common in those days. The children crowded around Mr. and Mrs. Dawson, curious to look up and down, but Pan stood far away, his eyes as dark as whirlpools, quietly watching them, his face showing no emotion. And so, Pan went to the United States with Mr. and Mrs. Dawson and was renamed George Dawson. The new foster parents were very kind and impeccable towards him. By the time he came to America, he was 12 years old and had his own understanding of the world. The foster parents did not try to change his values forcibly. Therefore, they maintained a very polite and appropriate relationship. Later, his sister married to France, and the foster parents lived romantically. They intended to move to France for a long time, but he had just entered college, and the foster parents hesitated. He had already become accustomed to constant separation and choices. He persuaded the foster parents, and in the end, they went to France, leaving him alone again. The fire crackled in the stove, startling George out of his thoughts. By the time he looked down at his bowl, it was piled high with food. George ate silently, his nose tingling with a sour feeling. When he looked up, Qiao Zhi's eyes were intense, and she smiled gently. Mom never wanted to abandon you. The sourness in George's nose quickly dissipated. His face turned cold. But the facts are here. When we were poor back then, your father... Qiao Zhi choked up. George slammed his chopsticks on the table. Is poverty an excuse? If we were poor, why did you have me? And if you had me, why didn't you want me? And if you didn't want me, why didn't you just kill me? George finished in one breath, his eyes now as red as blood. His chest heaved violently as he glared at Qiao Zhi. Don't lose your conscience, son. The village head couldn't bear it anymore and shouted at George, your mother had it tough. He reached out to grab Qiao Zhi's shoes. She dodged quickly, but the village head had already taken off her shoes and socks. Look, saying such things about your mother is like a fart from a nobleman. Have you no shame? They were a pair of feet covered in scars, severe bunions causing the bones to turn outward, and 4 toes deformed and twisted together like bound feet from ancient times. The nails, unable to withstand external pressure, had shed one after another, revealing the nail beds with white flesh streaked with blood. Back then, times were tough, and your father couldn't afford the fine. So he left you under the bridge. Your mother went crazy looking for you, running to the bridge all night long, but you were gone. Fearing you would be swept away, even though she hadn't recovered from childbirth, she jumped into the water to find you, searching for you all night. Now she has severe rheumatism. Otherwise, why do you think she's always sitting? She can't walk much anymore. The village head took a deep breath. Don't hate her anymore. These years, she's been living a hard life. Her husband and eldest son worked at the construction site. A load of cement fell from above and killed them instantly. Because they were working as illegal laborers, not a penny of compensation was received. Their bodies stayed at home, and her stomach was so bloated that she couldn't even afford 2 coffins. She went everywhere to borrow, to beg, and was met with closed doors everywhere. Your sister married into the mountains, for a dowry of 80,000 yuan, to marry a man with cerebral palsy. When your father died, he asked your mother if she could forgive him, but she said nothing, and your father gasped. Do you know what she's been doing all these years? The village head's eyes were already red. George sat motionless, clenching his fists tightly. His face remained calm, but his eyes were gradually moistening. Qiao Zhi's hair was disheveled on her cheeks. She wasn't crying, just smiling, tears streaming down her face, but her face still had a stiff smile. When you just lost, she went to the county TV station every day and knelt down at the door, rain or shine, for more than a month. People finally agreed to give her a 1-minute ad for missing children, and I went with her. They asked her to speak to you in front of the camera, crying with tears and snot. Pan, if you are alive, come find Mom. If you are gone, give Mom a dream, and Mom will come find you underground. But the TV station thought it had no effect, inserted in the middle of a TV series, and it was over. Later, your mother went to ask again, and the security guard stopped her outside. She went crazy then, and the people in the village said she was crazy. She was really crazy, and she went to the village primary school to leave you a school record and said you would come back sooner or later. She went to the civil affairs office and asked for a household registration for you, saying that you couldn't become a black household without waiting for my son to come back. Your brother and sister were not allowed to eat more than a mouthful of food at the table, saying they should leave some for you. She goes to the temple to burn incense, and she goes to the temple to worship, and every year she finds a bunch of big gods at home, hoping you'll come back. She doesn't even stick a door god in her home for the New Year's dinner, saying she's afraid of bumping into you and scaring you and never coming back again. She grinds soy milk every day and night, saying that when the milk was not enough, you couldn't eat goat milk, cow milk. Hungry wow, pick up the stick and give you a little sugar and you'll smile. And she's been grinding soy milk for 30 years, and she's been doing it nonstop for 30 years. Don't hate her anymore. You've had a good life for so many years. But she lost her husband and son and lost her youngest daughter, crying out her eyes, waiting for you every day. We all talk about having something to think about, but your mother's thought is waiting for you. If you live, wait for you to come back. If you don't, wait for your soul to come back until she goes to see Yama. George looked up at Qiao Zhi, tears streaming down her face, the fat under her eyes mingling with tears, like a blurred scar of flesh and blood. She still looked timidly and fearfully at her son, like a rough old tree, ugly and weak. George stood up with a sudden movement. He couldn't stand this scene, couldn't stand the initiator of it all weeping mournfully, couldn't stand others trying to reconcile, couldn't stand them stubbornly insisting it was his own aggressive fault. But what he couldn't stand most was himself. Because just a moment ago, his heart had almost softened. He almost wanted to hug her, to say, "Mom, I was wrong. Mom, I've come back." George's heart felt gripped by a giant hand, unable to breathe. No, he couldn't. If he forgave her, who would pay for those years? Those years were like a dark cloud constantly hanging over his head, an inseparable shadow. Even now, in the middle of the night, he would often wake up abruptly. In the darkness, he would always suspect he was back before he was 10 years old, with whips embedded in his flesh, his head forcibly dunked into icy water in his sleep, that snake-like hand, the loose voice of his foster father, "Don't be afraid." He had seen psychologists, spent a lot of money, changed many doctors, but there had been no improvement. The last psychiatrist wrote in his medical records, childhood exposure to stress events, currently exhibiting anxiety, dependency on substances, drug addiction, self-harm, borderline personality disorder, and other complex symptoms, difficult to cure. When there was food, he would keep eating until he was stuffed. Even if he couldn't breathe properly, he wouldn't stop because he was always afraid of not having enough to eat, just like when he was a child. Under great stress, he always felt a need to urinate urgently and sometimes even lost control, but the amount of urine was pitifully small. He didn't talk to people. If he had to talk, he would always be cautious, unsure which words would please or offend, so he tried to speak as little as possible, sometimes not at all. He was afraid of water. For many years after coming to America, every bath would inevitably be accompanied by screams. He always felt his foster father pressing his head into the sink. He struggled desperately. His lungs felt like they were about to explode, water pouring in through his 7 orifices. He felt like he was thrown into the sky or buried in the ground. Who would pay for this pain? George stood up, walked out without a word. Qiao Zhi rushed up, hugged him, tears soaking his back. He pried open Qiao Zhi's hand, but Qiao Zhi wouldn't let go. He turned around, suddenly smiling. My suffering, I can't even say. Don't leave. Mama's been waiting for you for more than 20 years. Mom can't let you go. With a bang, George suddenly turned around. Qiao Zhi was already kneeling on the ground, tears streaming down her face. Don't leave. Mom is kneeling to you. Mom is apologizing to you. George was shocked, wanting to pull her up, but his hand froze in midair. After a while, he turned decisively away, tears streaming down his face, even more at a loss, and went straight out the door. Qiao Zhi cried out, threw herself at George's legs, crying so hard she couldn't catch her breath. Mom is sorry for you. You can hit me and scold me. Just don't leave. As long as you don't leave, Mom will give you everything. Qiao Zhi didn't see that George's face was already tearful, but his voice was still cold, light and ghostly. For a while when I was a child, I thought about dying every day. Just hatred for you kept me alive. I used a small knife on my arm every day for a while. After a long time, there was nowhere on my arm. I started to cut on my legs. Later, there was nowhere on my legs. Actually, I didn't know if I hated you or waited for you. Once I cut a big artery and lost too much blood, my foster father also hit me. I passed out, but didn't die. At that time, I thought I would never wait again. I wanted to hate. He violently pushed Qiao Zhi away, took big steps, and soon disappeared into the vast night. In the cold wind, Qiao Zhi was like a dry piece of wood, looking lonely in the distance. In the not-so-distant Spring City, a bustling metropolis filled with cars and people, George resigned via email, then easily secured a position at the top provincial hospital. His resume lay there. The hospital staff couldn't believe it, eagerly signing his employment contract. Days passed swiftly in the hustle and bustle of daily life. George kept himself as busy as a spinning top, one surgery after another. He kept himself so occupied that he had no time to think, no time to hate. Many young nurses in the hospital would blush and whisper about him, but he found that, disabled as he was, he lacked even the capacity to love. He started drinking. When he drank too much, he would cry. He stood on the rooftop overlooking the city, thinking, who in this world truly understands another's pain? Only he knew his own. Only he buried the pain deep in his heart. He drank more, drifting in and out of dreams. In his dream, Qiao Zhi trembled and knelt. Mom is sorry for you. The phone rang piercingly in the deep night. George struggled to sit up, his face wet with tears. He stared blankly for a moment, finally realizing and answered the call. The hospital urgently summoned him back. They had just received an emergency. A mother had driven her daughter home after a car accident. The daughter, in the front passenger seat without a seatbelt, was nearly thrown out during the crash, her head smashing through the windshield, resulting in severe cranial trauma. She was already in shock upon arrival and also had congenital pulmonary valve stenosis, requiring a highly skilled cardiovascular surgeon for consultation. George had no choice but to go, quickly changing clothes and rushing out. The scene was horrific. Because it was a girl around 10 years old, more than 10 doctors in the operating room looked solemn, as if facing a great enemy. Over 5 hours later, George and the team wearily emerged from the operating room. The girl's mother, her face covered in blood, anxiously approached. How is she? Dr. Go from neurosurgery glanced at her, opened his mouth, and finally shook his head weakly. The woman stared at the doctor in disbelief, eyes wide open. After a long while, a desperate and mournful cry burst from her mouth, matching the blood-covered face, fierce and miserable. Many doctors couldn't bear it, exhaustedly leaving the operating room. George walked at the end, looking at the woman. For the first time in his life, he felt so uncomfortable. The woman grabbed George, her brow deeply cut, tears mixed with blood streaming down. She was in a frantic and broken voice. Doctor, please save her. She's only 11. Please save her. I'm begging you. I'm kneeling to you. Please. I can't lose her. She's my life, doctor. George let the woman push him around, tears and snot wiping onto him. He felt sorrow, not just for the grieving mother, but for reasons he couldn't articulate. The woman cried until she was physically exhausted, her weak voice still repeating, "Why wasn't it me who died? Why did I have to drive? Why did my daughter die? Why not me?" George quietly watched the woman, almost on the verge of madness, and guided her to sit down on a bench. The woman continued crying, and George listened quietly, occasionally consoling her. In the end, he lent his shoulder to the woman, listening earnestly to every word. Her tears fell on his shoulder, burning like fire. The woman cried until she had no more strength. In the end, her faint voice kept repeating, "Why wasn't it me who died?" As dawn approached, George messaged the nurse's station to administer a sedative to the woman. Exhausted, she slept heavily on his shoulder. He gently lifted her onto a hospital bed, tucked her in, and quietly left. The sky was already turning light. The cold winter air pierced his nose, making him want to cry. He looked out the window at the tall and short pine trees standing in rows in the distance, covered with snow, like tombstones neatly lined up. He went to the locker room to change clothes. The woman's words echoed in his ears. "You'll never know the pain of a mother losing a child. You want to accompany her in death. You fear she'll be lonely, but you dare not. You fear that one night she'll come back, the house cold and empty, without warm food." Quietly closing the door behind him, George glanced at the panda on his desk and gently tucked it into his arms before leaving. The car couldn't go any further at the foot of the mountain, so George parked it at the entrance of the village committee and continued on foot up the mountain. There was snow in the mountains, making the path slippery. George picked up a tree branch to use as a cane. Snowflakes were falling all around, and the distant view was unclear. After an unknown amount of time, George faintly saw smoke rising in the distance. Unexpectedly, his heart leaped with joy. He quickened his pace, tightened his down jacket and hat, with snow even falling on his eyelashes. George raised his hand to wipe it off, hastening his steps. He almost bumped into someone's arms. It was Qiao Zhi. Qiao Zhi was wearing a thin cotton jacket, with cotton showing at the hem, and cloth shoes with wet marks on them. Perhaps because it was too cold, she kept stomping her feet, leaving a mess of footprints on the ground. Her face was bright red from the cold, her eyebrows and eyelashes were frozen, and her messy hair was covered in snow. George was anxious. "What are you doing here? Have you been here long?" Qiao Zhi smiled innocently. "Not long, not long." "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for you." Qiao Zhi sniffed. "Do you know I was coming back?" "I didn't know." "If you didn't know, why wait foolishly?" George was a little angry. Qiao Zhi smiled again. "I've been waiting for more than 20 years. One day doesn't make much difference." George was stunned. "More than 20 years?" Qiao Zhi smiled as if she were telling someone else's story. "Since the day my child was lost, I've been waiting, always waiting. When I wait, I earn. When I can't wait, I scatter the grains and walk home, telling my child's soul to follow me home, and will be home soon." Suddenly, George felt heartache, tears flowing uncontrollably. He hurriedly wiped them away, muttering, "Snow is falling on my eyelashes again. So annoying." George accompanied Qiao Zhi back home. The Kong, heated brick bed, was already warm. Qiao Zhi happily went to slaughter a chicken, while George sat down with a bowl of red date tea, surveying the room. It was simple but tidy. The room was dimly lit, and the other end of the room was dark and indistinct. As he walked further into the room, he suddenly felt a punch to his heart. Against the wall were rows of dark wooden pandas. He tremblingly picked one up and examined it carefully. There were crooked, twisted little words on it. Panfan, age 4, Panfan, age 7, Panfan, age 15, Panfan, grown up. Some pandas still had dried bloodstains on them, colors he knew well as a doctor. So this was how she celebrated her son's birthdays and punished herself. Suddenly, George couldn't hold back his tears. For 31 years, he had only felt his own pain and suffering, thinking the world had treated him unfairly. But he had never realized how much more a mother suffers from losing her child. He lost his mother, but she lost her child. She longed for her child to come back every day, and this longing had tortured her into this ghostly appearance. Her son finally came back, only to say he hated her. Her heart must have shattered like broken glass. Do you ever know the pain of a mother losing her child? Do you want to accompany her in death because you fear she'll be lonely, yet you're afraid she'll come back one night to find a cold house with no hot meal? George took out the wooden panda from his pocket and placed it on the table, then knelt down, sobbing uncontrollably. For the 31 years of suffering, for George and for Qiao Zhi, how could he have ever thought he was the most unfortunate person in this world? How could he have thought Qiao Zhi was to blame? She had never been happy in her entire life. George cried his heart out. For 31 years, his foster father had never forgiven him, but he had also never forgiven his mother. How bitter must her heart have been. Qiao Zhi pushed aside the door curtain, her cheerful voice echoing from afar. "Child, how about we make braised chicken for dinner?" She pushed aside the door curtain, but her smile froze on her face. She dropped the basin in her hand and rushed over. "Child." Seeing George's tearful face, she screamed in alarm. "Child, what's wrong with you? Are you sick?" George slowly raised his head, tears rolling down like pearls. He stared straight into her eyes, as if he had experienced a century's worth of time. "Mother, I'm sorry." Qiao Zhi was stunned for a long time, and then a tear fell heavily. Outside the window, snowflakes fluttered. The neighbor's child was setting off firecrackers, laughing and running away. The yellow dog happily followed behind, barking joyfully. The chicken soup was already boiling, bubbling with fragrance. In a few days, it would be Chinese New Year.